Okay, we're officially live. And here we go. 3, 2, 1. Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 82 of the Comic Watchers Show, live streaming coming at you on Facebook and the YouTube. I'm your host, Matt. With me, as ever, are Mike and Nick, but we've got some other guests with us. Gentlemen, sound off.
Okay, I'll go first. My name's Gabriel.
Gabriel,
Hi.
welcome, sir.
And I'm Ross.
we got Ross. We know Ross. We love Ross, but this is Gabriel's first time on the show, so welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, we're very happy to have you with us. So we are jumping in this week. We're going to start a new, hopefully bi-weekly theme of the X-Men. This inaugural episode of that theme is going to be, where do you start with the X-Men? It can be kind of impenetrable. Everything's made up and continuity doesn't matter. So we've assembled a team of experts, so to speak, and we just thought we'd have a nice little chat. Please feel free to jump in and comment. Tell us we're absolutely right. Tell us you hate our shirts or our opinions, and we'll see what kind of damage we can do. Ross, I think you are up first. So what are your thoughts?
No pressure, Ross. No pressure.
No pressure.
Okay. So the simple answer is you should start at number 1. Okay. But I don't believe in that at all because I've read the first issues of X-Men. And that wall of words is just, it's a bit much for anybody. So I did some research and I think you can jump around. If you hit certain keystones in continuity, so you need to read some of the first issues. You can read the first 10 because that kind of sets you up. You get to introduce the X-Men. You get to check how creepy Charles Xavier is with his crush on Jean, and then from there you can sort of just spin up to Giant Size X-Men number 1. Now, for me, if I was going to start in one place, for me that is the start of modern X-Men. So that's probably where I would go for. So I'd read 10 issues of the beginning and you get some Stan and you get some Kirby, but I don't think you need to read 50 issues of it. And then start with Giant Size X-Men number 1. And then you can jump from there. I can go from there. You got to read Dark Phoenix. From Dark Phoenix, Brood Saga, Days of Future Past. Then you can pick up God Loves, Man Kills, and then you get into the more modern stuff. X-Men number 1. You got to do some of the 90s stuff, and you can do a slight backtrack there to read some Silvestri and some Claremont. From there, I'd jump to probably some Grant Morrison. And for me, Grant Morrison, if you're going to read, you can read the first. I like Grant Morrison, but if you read the E for Extinction is the one to read. After that, it's all good, but it's incidental. E for Extinction is the best part of that run, in my opinion. Astonishing from Whedon and Cassidy. The first Sure. In fact, that whole run's good, but the first 12 are exceptional. And yeah, that's kind of where I'd go from there. And then, it just goes from there. There's also read X Factor. Once you've done that progression, I'd read X Factor. That's 68 issues, first run. Excalibur, I think that's about 64 issues. You need to look at that. And obviously New Mutants, but quite honestly, I'm not a huge New Mutants fan. So for me, basically, Demon Bears and Sienkiewicz's run on New Mutants for me is basically the touchstone that I'd look at instead of having to read, say, everything. That's kind of where those are kind of the bits and pieces where I start. Maybe one other thing, if you want something from early on, X-Men season 1 or First Class, which is I think Hallam and McKelvey. That's the first year of the X-Men, but it's much more modern take than reading Stan and Kirby. That's also a good place to have a look. And that's me.
Okay. Let's see. We got some comments. Daniel Hutchins says he loves the 90s X-Men. 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s X-Men reading lists would be nice. Oh, I think we could probably get into something like that. To be continued, Daniel. Mike, how about you? What do you think?
I think for me, I've always considered the X-Men reading group such a protected club, almost like the Illuminati, right? Because there's two groups of X fans. There is those X fans that will pick up anything at the drop of a name of a mutant. Could be a new mutant, who knows, an old mutant. What form of Cyclops are we going to talk about? Doesn't matter, because they're going to pick up those books, which is fine, which is great, because I'm like that with any Spider title or anything with symbiote in it. So I totally get it and I totally understand it. And then there's those other people that are just kind of like, all right, what are they going to retcon now? What didn't happen? Okay, wow, X books. So I think it really just depends on the person that you're recommending an X book to. I think if you have someone that really wants to dive deep into that, I think you're going to start with Giant Size X-Men. You're going to pick it back up to the start of the Claremont stuff, and then you can go into like Dark Phoenix. But if it's someone that wants that quick pick-me-up, like Grant Morrison, maybe Jim Lee stuff, X-Men 1, since the 90s just was like an abundance of just, I want to say weird drawings, but the 90s definitely had as an era of art and storytelling. So I really think, and all those eras are good. I mean, pretty much I'm going to piggyback off of what Ross said, because he really nailed it on the head. You have E for Extinction. You have, Dark Phoenix. You got Days of Futures Past. I mean, so many, God Loves, Man Kills. So many great X titles out there. I think that this really, you got to curtail it to the reading style of the person, and especially if they're kind of like very new to X-Men, definitely don't get them on the new stuff like with Hoxpox. Please don't. Start with great stuff, by the way, because I'm sure we're going to get some X fans going, you can't talk about Hickman, but there's a such thing as Krakoa Burnout. That'll be the next podcast, by the way, we'll talk about. Anyway, but yeah, I think it really just depends on the reader itself and what their interests are, and maybe and I don't say this in a mean way, but attention span, because you can't have them, especially with the Claremont stuff, because there is just paragraph after paragraph per panel of descriptions that go into his writing. Great stuff, but I think it just really just depends on the person. But yeah,
I think that's true. I mean, if you're talking about a more modern, younger skewing reader, dropping them deep into Claremont probably isn't the way to go.
Bad idea.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Gabriel, let's bring you into the conversation. What about you?
So I think I agree with Mike that it kind of depends on where the person is coming from. So if I got someone who is in love with the old 90s cartoon, I'm going to recommend them to pick up with the X-Men 1, because it does have that feel. If they mostly came from the realm of the movies, then I reluctantly will recommend Morrison or Whedon's Astonishing. In general, though, and I feel like I'm going to be in the minority here, I feel like a great place for a new reader to pick up is actually right at Decimation, right after House of M. Because the only knowledge you need going in there is that things got bad.
Yes.
And then you can just pick up, and they have such amazing stories. They got Peter David's X Factor. They got the Academy X turning into New X-Men. I will always and forever have a soft space for New Excalibur. And even the main titles, the X-Men and the Uncanny X-Men, they launched into these newer, interesting stories that didn't really have too much back continuity wrapped up into it. The Rise and the Fall of the Shi'ar Empire kind of did, but I felt they handled it in a way that you didn't need to go into that, having read all of the etc. sagas that happened in the past. And then you also bypass all of the more difficult issues to get through, like the initial issues or the Claremont paragraphs. You just get to dive right into the more modern stuff.
I think that's actually a really valid point. I wouldn't have actually thought about the Decimation era, but that's spot on. I mean, if we're talking about a new reader, that's still like 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself could, just because of how much has come between then and now, might be a little daunting. But I do think that's an excellent point for Decimation. Nick's kind of our new ex-kid on the block, though. He's like a Spawn guy or whatever.
Who reads Spawn anymore?
Nick does, and he will tell us about it. And we love it.
Spawn 307 is coming out in June. You got to check it out.
Hey, wrong show. So let's, as your relative newness to the X-Men goes, I mean, what are your thoughts on where would be a good place to jump in?
Yeah, Mike actually just said, I think when he first started, I really love that it feels like a protected readership, where it's so intimidating to jump into because there's all this lore and there's all this back history. And, if you want to jump into this event, well, it's happening in the middle of, this, and this is what you need to read to catch up to it. It's just a lot. And then the X-Men encompasses so many different characters with mutants. It's so intimidating. And, where do I even start at? And when I first started reading, the best advice I was ever given is, read what interests you. And I think that applies really well to the X-Men. To piggyback off what Ross said about the lack of continuity from a readership angle, you can jump in anywhere and kind of make sense of it. But the X-Men is a complicated issue. I'm a fan in the sense that I've read tons of Wolverine, and I've only read X-Men through his entanglement with the X-Men occasionally. Most of the stuff I've read is his solo run. So whenever I come across the question of somebody asking how to get into the X-Men, it's like, well, which X-Men characters do you know you like? And that is a great way to find your pathway into this huge, expansive team and what it means for the larger Marvel universe. And Wolverine was my way in. The early 80s run where you eventually get to like Peter David taking him to Japan and stuff like that. Just really, really awesome stuff. And it's like, yeah, he's a mutant, but I'm not really caught up in this storyline of the X-Men. It's solely focused on Logan and Wolverine and what that means. And as you start to bring in characters that he has relationships with, you get more familiar with them. And I think that is an effective way to get into something like the X-Men. You can always jump into X-Men 1, go into these teams, X-Factor, X-Force. There's tons of these teams that are so intimidating to just look at and say, where do I go? But if you like a character like Gambit or you like a character like Storm, there's these series that you can jump into that introduce you to a much more narrow focus. And it kind of serves as this great pathway into the fandom. And that's something that, as I was talking with everybody at Comic Watch and where to start reading, that was kind of what happened. And I knew I liked Bishop, so Cody suggested District X, and amazing, so good. And I feel like that's how the X-Men fandom works too, and it's such a unique thing that you don't really see often in comics, that it almost feels like its own section in comics. There's Marvel, there's DC, and there's X-Men fandom. There's this totally other thing, and it really works on that level. And I think if you can approach it in that term and, what am I interested in? And, well, this character. Well, what is their biggest influence in X-Men? And that's a great path to find your way into the fandom and to the comics.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, most people are down with Wolverine. Daniel Hutchins is down with Cable, X-Force, and New Mutants. So
nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that.
No.
And Mike, he also says Wolverine is the best character. So there you go.
Boom. Show's over. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.
He's going to do the little dance now while we're not watching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think fans are it's not just comics with with X-Men now either. Like Gabriel said, if you know the animated series, there's something huge there with the fandom who has purely watched the cartoons or the animated series. They don't know with the comic side of it, the movies now have blown up and have their own section of history and lore that's equally intimidating. And it's something that I think that is all encompassing in the discussion, where to begin with the X-Men, and to navigate these different mediums into comics, and the best way to do that.
And in a way, like if you have that character that you're obsessed with, that almost makes it easier, because then you can just, rather than ducking in and out like Ross was saying, you can just follow that character.
Yeah,
I know,
True.
actually, I know multiple people who will read through the X-Men, but they will only follow Jubilee's story.
Oh,
So they would follow that track through the X-Men, Generation X, New Warriors, etc., now Excalibur. And they don't need the grand picture of the X-Men because they don't really care. They care about Jubilee.
right. That makes sense. I think for me, if I was to just sit down with somebody with no to minimal comics and or X-Men exposure, and come up with one or two things that just said defined X-Men in general. If we're just looking for a one-off, I think God Loves, Man Kills has got to be it. That story just gets to the heart of what the X-Men are about in such a perfect one and done way. If we're talking about something a little more long form, but not so long to be intimidating, I gotta say Whedon and Cassaday's Astonishing X-Men. It's just such a nuts and bolts approach, and it was sort of as an aside, it was sort of a rebuke to the Morrison era. I mean, right there in the first issue, Cyclops puts everyone back in traditional superhero uniforms and says, all that black leather was scaring people. We need to remind the world that we're heroes. And I mean, yeah, okay. I don't know. I just like that. I like that approach. I like that take. It's like, hey, this is the pure Coke, so to speak. Uncut, unfiltered. This is what the X-Men are about. I mean, and I've been reading X-Men for as long as I've been reading comics, which is for almost 3 decades now. So I've got to really pick through my brain to untangle all of this lore and continuity and reverse continuity to come up with something just as an entry point. So that's my 2 cents on the subject. Ross, you had mentioned the Claremont era, and of course we all know, Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past are, not just major touchstones for the X-Men, but comics in general. What other, if we're diving into the Claremont era, I mean, I guess we should specify for, assuming that someone listening doesn't know what exactly we're talking about. Can you speak to that Claremont era and exactly why it's held in such high reverence?
Yeah, well, the story and narrative got a hell of a lot more complex. He fleshed out. They weren't cardboard cutout superheroes anymore. He kind of fleshed them out and made them human beings. But I mean, and don't get me wrong, I find Dark Phoenix a heavy read. It's not an easy read. For me, if you go a little bit further down the road into the Brood Saga, that's much easier for me. It's much easier for me to connect with. It was much easier for me to connect with Claremont through the Brood Saga, because that's it is kind of where I started, but that's neither here nor there. At that point, he's kind of hit his stride. Narratively, it's, in my opinion, and it's not a popular opinion, it's superior to the Dark Phoenix Saga, because he's found his feet. Understand? Then you bring in, you've got Cockrum Vine, you've got Paul Smith coming right in at the end with the art, and the combination of that, it was just really easy to connect to. I was reading at the time, I was reading Teen Titans, a whole bunch of things, but I picked up 166, and and remember, that's the last issue of the Brood Saga. I had no history up until that point with that. But I got the story just from that book. And that's why, for me, that era, it was easy to connect with. And then as you kind of move down the line, a lot of the stories, there is an overall arcing continuity, but a lot of them are one shots. They're not these long arcs. They're short stories. Logan's here and he's leaving. He's going back to Canada or something. But there's bits and pieces. But it's an episode about Kitty stuck in the mansion. She wants to be an X-Men. You can read that as a one shot. You understand? You've got Dracula. You've got the Dracula issue. You can read it as a one shot. You understand? In that area, there's a whole, but they can all be read as self-contained stories, and you don't actually have to know anything about what's come before. Here's the team. This is what's happening. It's focused on this person, and that's sort of the golden era for me of Claremont's era, is round about the 80s. Moving towards the 90s, but not quite there. It was just really easy to follow. I mean, to put it in perspective, I could not buy, there was no comic shops. I couldn't buy comics in sequence. So I would have to find comics. But I would, and sometimes I would miss 10 issues, and then I'd find an issue, but I could still follow the overall logic of what he was actually doing with the story. I mean, if you took Hox Pox and you took 12 issues and you pick any 3 issues and took them out, did you know what was going on if you read that? No. And that's what made Claremont's era so great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Una's here.
Welcome.
All right, so we're going to bring in a 6th voice to the conversation. Duna Aller is in the house. Hello and welcome.
Hi.
So, as befitting the theme of the episode, we were kind of just going through and giving personal recommendations on where to start and fleshing them out a little bit. But let's hear it from you. Where would you recommend somebody start with the X-Men?
Okay, I think that's a difficult question. I think everyone thinks it's a difficult question, but I think it depends on what you like to see, in other media. What movies do you like to see? What stuff do you like to enjoy? I think if someone enjoys stuff that is apocalyptic and very, I don't know, very futuristic, I will go for the Age of Apocalypse, for example. I think that was my start into X-Men comics, not into X-Men. Into X-Men generally it was the animated series and that stuff, but into comic it was Age of Apocalypse. And I don't think it's about a star, even if it's weird. And if you like something more ghost or more alternative, I would say you can start with Generation X. You can even, if you like more modern comics, start with the modern Generation X and then go back to who are those characters, etc. And then if you want something I want to get into classic X-Men, I would recommend to start on the giant size X-Men issue. I think that's the one that really gets you going on a long run. And those would be mine. I think they came a little weird choices, but that's because I just entered and whatever comes to mind. But yeah, that's it.
No, I think it's really cool. It's right in line. I think with a lot of us, it's such a difficult question. I think it's worthy of an episode because of how difficult of a question it is. And there's going to be tons of different recommendations because we all come from these different places of love with certain eras and certain characters. And it really is about pinpointing, your interest in the X-Men and in which story fleshes out that interest out the most.
I do like what Duna had said about Age of Apocalypse. I didn't think about that kind of like backdoor entry. Since it's this alternate universe, you go in and you don't need any prior information. And in the same way, I kind of think that maybe Ultimate X-Men might be a good start for some people, since it's made to be an entry point into the Marvel Universe. And then you can kind of maybe figure out what characters you want to see more about in the main universe.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about the Ultimate X-Men, but yeah. I mean,
A lot
by
of people don't
design,
think
it
about
was
that
supposed
before.
to be easy access. So.
I mean, I also am biased in the way that I think, for me, Age of Apocalypse worked. Like, it worked for getting me into X-Men. It was like, wow, this is like so cool and so futuristic, and I love the characters. And then I got to know the characters better in a less weird setting.
And it's funny because all the guys working on those books at the time were all looking at each other going, is this going to work?
Well, they definitely pulled it off. I'll make
They
the
did.
argument that 90s X-Men peaked with Age of Apocalypse.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Mm.
But a cool thing, since we were talking about, to go back to the Claremont, and especially for folks that may be listening out there, may or may not know, that I believe it's still on Amazon Prime, that there is a super rad Chris Claremont documentary on there, and how he got involved with X-Men and all that stuff.
Really?
So, yeah. I mean, it's really, really good and really, really insightful. Even if you know everything about the Claremont stuff and you're well versed in everything, X books and X titles, it's still a rad documentary to get into, and that could easily kind of maybe pave the way for some new X readers and where to jump on and stuff like that. Now, I still think the Claremont might not be the best jumping on point, just because of just the deepness of everything. And if you like just one panel full of words, depending on the story, it works. But it may or may not be for you. But however, I still think that Claremont era of X-Men, I mean, he did save the X franchise. I honestly believe that if Claremont didn't do what he did, then we probably would have like X titles. We probably have like, the cousin of X, Cyclops in 2054, just really goofy X titles that really don't make sense. But not that we don't have those now.
Some might argue we have
Something like Major
I was
X.
about to say, not that we don't have like 35 X titles now that spawned out of Pox, but Marvel. But yeah, definitely, I think that Claremont documentary could be a great stepping stone for some new X readers and stuff like that if you got Prime.
Yeah. I love that Ross mentioned that so many of the Claremont issues are one-shots.
Yeah.
Because not many people bring that to attention enough, because it's so intimidating to look back at those early 200, 300 issues and understand what's going on. But you really can pick most of them up. And once you start reading into them, you're like, oh, I can do this. And then you start figuring out which ones you want to jump in and out of. And it's a really fun time. And it's not something that's well known, I feel like, for people jumping into X-Men. When you look at Claremont's era, you think, well, where do I start at? You can kind of jump in a lot of different places with those one-shots. They're some of my favorite X-Men books.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, my all-time favorite Wolverine story is the two-parter from Uncanny 172 and 173, where they go to Japan.
Yeah.
Paul Smith art. Everyone's been poisoned. Wolverine, of course, is immune, and his only other ally is Rogue, who's just joined the X-Men and nobody's ready to trust her yet. And the Silver Samurai is in town, and it's just a perfect Wolverine.
And it's Paul Smith at his absolute most glorious.
Man,
he could panel like I've never seen in my life.
Yes.
Never mind the drawing.
Absolutely. So, yeah, a lot of good places to jump in. But I mean, it's also intimidating just because of the sheer outgrowth of titles that have spun out of X-Men as well. So, I mean, if you're not necessarily, if you're intimidated by the core X-Men books, but maybe looking for something X adjacent to get into, what do you guys think about that? I mean, Ross, you mentioned a few, and Gabriel, you mentioned New Excalibur, but
Yeah, I'm a
yeah,
sucker
go on.
for it. I know it gets a lot of hate. I don't care. It's amazing, and I will fight people over it.
You know, that's one I actually haven't read. What did it run, about 20, 25 issues?
I don't even know if it made it that far, to be completely honest.
Okay. But it was Claremont, right?
Yes.
Okay. And it was set after Decimation, is that right?
Yep. It was set right after Decimation, and it's essentially exactly what Excalibur usually is, and that is the British X-Men. And it put together a team of people that is not expected, which was a lot of the post-Decimation titles. So you have Captain Britain, which makes sense for Excalibur, and Pete Wisdom, which also makes sense. But then they give them as well, they also give them Sage, they give them Nocturne, who is Nightcrawler's daughter from an alternate dimension, but they don't bog you down with all of that. And then they also give you Dazzler and Juggernaut, which is the buddy book that I've been craving since that series ended. They worked so well together, and I will also forever be a fan of Dazzler's buzzed pink haircut because it's badass. But definitely, it's a quirky read, and if I'm recommending a X adjacent title from the Decimation era, it has to be X Factor. Just because I find that to be completely amazing. It doesn't have your stereotypical X-Men feel. It's more of a bit noir, which is what it was intended to be. And just like New Excalibur, it kind of picks characters that, especially at the time, were frequently overlooked, but quickly gained like this massive fan following. And it has Richter, which I'd read the back of a shampoo bottle if it was about Richter. I don't care. So I think that's a great place to dive in.
Well, and I mean, that X Factor run is really self-contained. I mean, it's pretty lengthy. It's around 100 issues all told, or something like that.
The numbering got weird at the end because it took legacy numbering, so I have no idea how long that one is.
Yeah, I think it's like Peter David's second longest run of his career, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, essentially what Marvel gave David license to do was take all of these kind of underutilized characters, put them together, and just do whatever the hell he wanted. And it's awesome. Start to finish.
Almost finished. That Shatterstar parentage issue I want burned from my memory forever. But other than that, it's great from start to end.
I mean, I also am deeply disturbed by that moment in which Jamie has a baby, but actually doesn't have a baby.
My heart.
Those issues are like, I mean, it's good. It's awesome, but it's also like, oh my God.
Too soon. It's still too soon to talk about that scene. I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry. It's all I can think about. I still can't forget it.
Also, what Peter David committed to with Shatterstar and Richter will forever grant him my loyalty, because it is one of those things that was hinted and then not hinted and then forgotten about, and it's something that was needed, and Peter David took that step and put it clear on panel, obviously not able to be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, how about you? What are some X adjacent runs you might recommend?
And I know everyone is going to chuckle on this one. I'm going to go New Mutants, regardless. No, we're going to go the original New Mutants.
Okay.
Even before, I knew you sons of people.
I'm surprised Duna didn't say that earlier, if I'm being completely honest. I was waiting for it. I'm surprised you beat them.
No, even before he who must not be named, and it's not Voldemort. But no, even before that, I just always thought the New Mutants, that run was really good. And it's still good. I still think it kind of holds up the test of time. Tons. I mean, Simonson, McFarlane, him, Claremont, all of them. There was just good art. There was just good reading and stuff like that. And I still think it goes well. And even I will say a new book I'm really enjoying in X-Titles, Marauders. I think is really, really good. And just enjoying, the Hellfire story. Emma's in there. Kitty Pryde not being able to get into Krakoa, I think is really cool. And hopefully they can do something pretty imaginative with that. I hope it's not going to just drop and go, oh, well, she doesn't have a power necklace and that's why she can't get in. And she has to sail the 7 seas to, get Xavier's power necklace to get into Krakoa or something like that before the new Civil X War starts or something, But yeah, I mean, stuff like that. I think that's really good. So, OG New Mutants, Marauders, those are two that I would recommend that are not, quote unquote, X-Men books.
What about the other New Mutants? I think that might be a good place to jump in. The one that led into Academy X.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's not for me, but
I'm sure I have a book of that, but not here.
Duna's prepared for almost everything.
Right. Yeah. Sure. So what, Matt? What about you, man? What non-X titles would you recommend?
Well, Gabriel stole a little bit of my thunder with X Factor, so I can't go there again. Although I would gladly gush about that run for another hour. I'm gonna piggyback off one that Duna recommended and go old school Generation X. Show my age a little bit. Because the group of characters that they brought together for this series are not pretty, so to speak. You've got Skin, Chamber, Penance. They're kind of like the weird kids that hang out under the bleachers and smoke during the pep rallies.
100%.
And the book itself is largely self-contained, and Scott Lobdell wrote it, and he wrote the hell out of it. It's such a fun run. I want to say his run ends around issue 27 or 28, and then after that, the quality of the book dives a bit. But like for what it is, just kind of getting into the idea of mutants learning and mutants accepting one another as individuals and how they were born. Generation X is great. I would also recommend a little more recently and kind of on those same terms, Wolverine and the X-Men by Jason Aaron. As far as the last decade goes, I don't think any other book so perfectly encapsulated what I want to see in an X-Men book. It flips the script and puts Wolverine in the teaching role. He's got to learn to be a bit more, little less Wolverine than he would normally be inclined to be. And he takes this role of teaching these kids and keeping them safe so seriously. And it brings out this awesome mentor role in Wolverine that we just don't see really often, but it suits him so well. And the series itself has a wonderful sense of fun. There's lots of over-the-top things, like the entire mansion is a danger room, and you can have a quote-unquote pop quiz come out of the wall at you at any point, even in the bathroom. Or the grounds is a Krakoa. So just super fun. I loved that series. I was extremely sad to see it end. Or at least Jason Aaron's time on it, I should say. So Nick, as our newbie to the X world, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it falls back into what I had previous said. Most of my introductions with X-Men are through characters I love. Another one was I follow a lot of Deadpool. It gets a lot of hate on comics, but the comics are solid. Like, I'm such a fan of the humor in it. I don't need such serious moments all the time. So about the time, I can't believe it's 10 years old now, but the Uncanny X-Force from Reminder and Jerome Pena, I got introduced to that run because at the time in the Marvel Unlimited app, it was like really popular about 2010, and I was heavy into Deadpool at the time. And I'm like, oh, look, Deadpool's in this random X book, and I like X-Men, sure. So I start reading this basically for Deadpool, and Wolverine's involved as pretty much as usual with a lot of X books, especially at the time. I found that I really enjoyed it, and it was one of the first X books that was a book that wasn't Deadpool or Wolverine solo titled that I actually liked. And it kind of showed that I could get into the team books a little bit more. And honestly, I'm just a fan of Reminder and a lot of what Reminder does. And this series kind of plays to his strength. The first volume or the first arc is the Child Apocalypse. And like, it's such a great Savage team to go up against a child like that. But I think those types of stories I would recommend, and they fall in line with, what character do you like? Because these teams are so character driven. You can kind of pick out, which team lineup you'll like the most. And X-Force was just something that had a lot of the characters that I liked. That's where some of my appreciation and eventual fandom for Psylocke came in, where I followed through that whole wild arc that goes to some really strange places. But it gets into what Gabrielle said about how you can latch onto a character and just follow that character through their trajectory in this larger X universe. Because I found myself bouncing all around with Psylocke stuff. And even though it started at Uncanny X-Force, there's solo titles and coming in and out of the X titles and stuff like that with the reincarnate version. And then eventually, if you're doing the modern books, they split, and now you've got Betsy and Psylocke as two different people. And it's like, well, how does that happen? And you can follow that trajectory backwards through the X-Men timeline in a really interesting way. And I think that's a great way to kind of do X adjacent books and still weave your way through the X timeline.
I think for me, I would, as much as I love that run of Uncanny X-Force, I wouldn't recommend that one right off the bat because it's really continuity heavy. You've got to really know some X stuff to dive straight into that book and truly appreciate it. I feel, my opinion is a little tainted because I've got so many years under my belt reading X-Men. So
yeah, a lot of that comes in like the characterizations in what the team does with these characters and where they're at in this timeline. And that's where a lot of the intimidation comes from, because I didn't notice that in my first read through. I didn't realize that you're not picking up on some of the nuances of the story or what these characters are bringing into it and what it means going forward. I'm just, reading along to see Deadpool and Wolvie in a team book together pretty much, and I'm getting all that satisfaction out of it. And I think that's kind of both the positive and the negative, I guess, with X books, and that you can kind of jump in like that, and maybe you're not pulling together the full picture of it, but you can find enjoyment out of them. And when you go back and you start piecing other series that you're interested in that happen around about the same timeline, you start putting this some fashion of a linear timeline in your head, where you start understanding the different timelines and arcs of all these different characters. It's just so much to keep up with.
Well, and when we start talking about timelines and alternate timelines and time travel in reference to the X-Men, that's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
It's a whole other bottle of whiskey.
You might want some whiskey by the time we're done trying to explain it.
I'm not sure if it was Daniel Way's Deadpool run, but that would be the one that I would definitely plug. I think that's the one where he eventually tied in, where you get Deadpool wearing the was it Jean Grey's X-Men outfit that had the skirt and everything. It was like, I'm an X-Men member now. I think that's where that run happens. If you're a fan of Deadpool, that's like the perfect one to get into it, because Daniel Way just kills it in that one, and you get some introduction to his relationships with some of the X-Men characters.
That's disturbing. But funny.
I got that image of Deadpool in my head now, and it's not going away.
Yeah, I don't need to
I
see
love
Deadpool
it.
in a short skirt.
I love that image of Deadpool in my head.
I have not forgotten it years later. It is so memorable. It's such a
It's
memorable
iconic.
line. Yes.
It's iconic.
Yeah.
It's so true.
Definitely. So Daniel Hutchins asked maybe for short reading lists by decade. Going back to the 60s, that's a little bit of a tall order, but if we were going to try to attempt it, I don't know. Where would we start, Ross?
No, go. Like I said earlier, go the first 10 issues of the original run, 1 through 10.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to read it all. I mean, and bully for you if you read it all. I mean, I read it all, and it's a heavy read, and it's, if you think Claremont is text heavy, you have no idea. But you only need to. You can read Marvel Masterworks #1 X-Men. I think Volume 1. It's 1 to 10. That's for me. That would be enough from that era, and then I'd jump straight to Giant Size.
I think I would want to include a little bit of the Neil Adams stuff in there.
Fair.
If nothing else, for the visuals. But you've got the introduction of Havoc and Polaris, Sauron.
Yeah, so you could probably run like maybe 5 to 10 issues before Giant Size, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Because it's just
first
before
10
kind
issues,
of,
last 10 issues.
Yeah, basically.
More or
That's
less.
that's what I would do. 60s into 70s. That's what I would do.
Yeah. I mean, then you get into the 70s and just go full bore into the Claremont era. Start with the Dave Cockrum, and then John Byrne comes on board, and you're set. Getting to the 80s, though, gets a little more complex. We'd, of course, want to throw Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past in there, but what do you guys think beyond that for the 80s?
Got to put the Brood Saga in there.
Yes.
Got to put the Brood Saga in there. As Guardian Wars, maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
But then it starts to get complex because you're crossing with other things as well.
I think they've got trades of that out, though.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if nothing else.
Like everyone was saying earlier, I think that we definitely need to include the opening issues to New Mutants.
Yes, definitely.
Exactly. Just such great characters in that, and it's a great introduction to all of them.
Also, I think it helps for the 80s and 90s events to read New Mutants, because I feel like for Inferno, for Extermination, the Mutant Massacre, not reading New Mutants gives you a very like sided perspective. Like you only read Uncanny X-Men or Uncanny and X-Factor maybe or something like that. You don't really get the events. At least Inferno, I think it's impossible. Also because it's like the inflection point of New Mutants, no? When it starts being Boom Boom and this new team and Iliana dies and everything. But like if you don't read New Mutants, you read Inferno, only the X-Men issues, and you get like half of the story. You get like everything in middle pieces. So I feel like for enjoying the 80s first 19th X-Men, you need to read New Mutants, or at least know what it's about a little bit.
I think I agree with that. And I mean, New Mutants is a really accessible book from start to finish because the whole 100 issues only has 2 writers. The first 50 issues was Claremont, and the second 50 issues was Louise Simonson.
Correct.
And yeah, both runs are excellent.
I feel a little ashamed that I didn't recommend it the first one when you asked me, but probably because I think if someone doesn't know anything about X-Men, it's weird to get into New Mutants without knowing at least a few about the main characters, like the main group, to know their relationship with them and Kitty and that stuff a little bit.
Well, we have a few comments. Daniel Hutchins has been giving us some recommendations on X-adjacent books, Wolverine, New Mutants, Cable, X-Force, and a fan of the 80s and 90s X-Men. Also suggested the original X-Men from Marvel Masterworks, and asked if any of us had read X-Men Legion. I haven't.
He means the Legion? He means the Spurrier run or not?
Does he mean the X-Men Legacy run that starred Legion?
Yeah.
I wonder.
If that's one, it's amazing.
Yes, definitely great.
Okay.
I
I don't
picked
know.
up the first issue of that for $1 a couple of weeks ago. Fantastic. I'm gonna have to
It's
get
incredible. I think it's one of the best character works of X-Men. Like focused on one, actually two characters a lot. I think that's weird for X-Men, except solos, but solos are not like 12 issues, are like leader. So I think it's great, that one.
I also think he picked great supporting cast that doesn't really get used that often. Like you get Frenzy, you get Chamber, you literally have a couple of issues where it's just British mutants. And I think it's just like something that's not done often.
Yeah, see, now I have to get the rest of the run.
Yeah, I'm just taking notes through all of this.
Yeah, make some
You
notes
have to.
there, Nick. You expect to be caught up in 2 weeks.
I'm just steady writing.
Actually, Ross, you mentioned the Brood Saga. I would also say the sequel to the Brood Saga from Uncanny 232, 233, and 234. Silvestri art, 3 issues, you can knock it out. It's a great story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I took a massive break from X-Men. I missed a lot of stuff. I missed the mutant. I missed them dying and everything else. And I picked up the first issue of that arc, and that sucked me right back in again. And it's quick. It's 3 issues. It's disturbing. I mean, if you read that, it's exceptionally dark. It's like reading a horror. It's like reading a horror comic almost. I mean, it's so different from previous X-Men that I'd read before. I mean, it just pulled me straight back in. I mean, the covers are all kind of almost horror covers with this horrible teeth and everything on it. That's definitely something I recommend.
Without getting too deep into crossover territory for the 80s, I would recommend also the 3 Fall of the Mutants issues for Uncanny, which was 225 through 227. That was an excellent story.
And it had also, like, I don't know if it's 2 issues of New Mutant that were also amazing, but they're separate stories, but they're like related in the theme only. It's very great.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Mike, did you have any stories from the 80s you wanted to throw in there?
I agree with everything Ross has said.
Kiss
I'll give you I'll PayPal you that $10 later.
Thank you. No.
Let me ask this question, because we're kind of getting stuck in that era there. Let's just roll it up to something much more new. Okay, so if somebody said to you, I want to read something that's X-Men, but I'm really not interested in going back to Heather and Jon. I want a 6 to 12 issue story that kind of encapsulates the X-Men. Because, we haven't talked about Tom Taylor's X-Men Red at all. Now, let's not kid ourselves. There's stuff in there that, it's Cassandra Nova. I mean, if you haven't read Morrison's run, you're not going to be super familiar with the main antagonist, you understand? But I mean, as a self-contained story that encapsulates the feeling of what the X-Men or traditional X-Men are supposed to be, in a modern comic, that's something I'd put down in front of somebody, because you don't necessarily have to have. They want to read about X-Men. They don't need to know that Logan's Wolverine. You can give them Laura as Wolverine, and it works. You can give them Jean in charge instead of Charles or Cyclops, and it works. And then you've got the humor. You've got Gabby in there as well. You've got humor. You've got Gambit thrown in there, which is a throwback to the 90s era. I mean, it's kind of a cluster of a whole bunch of eras thrown together, and it's self-contained. You can read that as a once-off story and never read anything else again.
I was intimidated by X-Men Red just because of the existence of Blue and Gold, and I had no idea what any of those meant together. So I just didn't.
And yet
It's
they
like
didn't touch
Pokemon,
each other at all.
I hear a lot of people talking about X-Men Red, but nothing about Blue or Gold. And
There's a reason for that.
Blue and Gold aren't that good.
They're not. Yeah.
I think it has its moments.
It does. Gabriel's right. It has its moments, but it's just overall. I think the word that comes to mind is disappointing. To be quite
Well,
honest,
I didn't hear what it was you're talking about.
Blue and Gold.
Gold and
Blue and
Blue.
Gold.
Oh, I gave it 4 issues.
There's highlights. There's moments in there that that Bunn actually gets certain things so right, and there's like pages that you can find that are perfect X-Men, but then the rest of it just falls apart.
One of the problems with
X-Men Gold was fan service, and it was deliberately packaged fan service for readers of a particular age.
The end got better. I like the ending. I like the ending. I feel like it got better after the ad hoc team. I feel like it picked up a little bit with the new Pyro and adding Iceman. I feel like it gave it something that it was missing in the beginning. But
I'd never give that to somebody as a first-time reader.
Oh God.
No.
Not even.
No, an X-Men Red is good for that. I agree. I think that it's the only book also for me that comes to mind when you think like 12 issues and it has to explain what is X-Men to people. I totally agree with Ross. Also,
I feel like
I'm
X-Men
winning
Blue is the
today.
exact opposite. Because X-Men Blue, it's in order to read it and get any enjoyment from it, you need to understand the concept that this is time travel, and you need to know why it's weird for them. You need to know where these 5 characters ended up. It is just way too deeply rooted in continuity.
You've got to
you
go
need to
spend
know.
time with Bendis. You've got to go spend time with Bendis. If you're not going to go spend time with Bendis, reading Blue's a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
This is so useful.
Yay! We've succeeded.
also, I think I have another recommendation. If someone is interested in X-Men but isn't really interested at all in knowing anything about the characters or the lore or like going back or like knowing anything at all, I think Exiles is a great run.
Yes.
Because you get the feeling Exiles. The first Exiles, not the new Exiles, the first one, which is like 100 issues. And I think that's a great comic that you don't have to know absolutely anything about any character from any other comic.
And if you're confused, it's because they want you to be. So it's.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, and it's pretty self-contained, right? Because it's the team bopping around to various alternate realities, right?
Yep.
I haven't read it.
I think the closest,
and it's alternate versions as well.
Yep. I think the closest it comes to touching base with continuity is that Beak, of all people, joins the team for a couple of issues, but you don't need to know who Beak is. He just pops up and he's there. And then in the Exiles that follows after it, New Exiles, it ends in a crossover event with Excalibur. But you if you get that far, you'll be fine.
Okay.
Cool.
Very cool. Very cool.
I came into the Hickman era pretty excited that it would be new reader friendly, and I've heard quite the opposite here today about where to jump into for X-Men and it not being Hickman.
I've actually handed off House of X, Power of X to a couple of people who haven't read comics, and they didn't have any problems picking up and getting into it. As long as you know what the X-Men is, but also you're not going to enjoy it the same as like that issue with Moira. You're not going to really care too much if you have no idea who Moira is.
Because it's not going to blow your mind. It's going
Exactly.
but with knowing the backstory, when you find out what Moira is and what she's been up to, it's like your brain melts. I mean, my brain melted. I threw the comic across the room. I did. I went like, what the fuck?
But that being said, if someone was new and wanted to get into modern comics, I would actually suggest them just jump over Hoxpox and go straight into the Dawn of X titles under the knowledge that Kuroka is a thing. If they know that, I feel like nothing really else was set in House of X and Powers of X other than the forming of Dawn of X.
Yeah, I think Hickman said, once we got past Hoxpox, this is how it is. He's telling his story. There's a couple of references in there, but you can follow his story. Because the idea is they want to attract new readers, and they want to satisfy old readers. So they've made it new reader friendly. Yes, there's a lot of them, but it has a singular starting point. And Krakoa is the singular starting point. Everything else is incidental after that. Everything else stems from that. And I mean, if you look at his charts, he likes to stem everything from a single point, old Hickman. And it works. It stems from a single point. That's it. Yes, there's lots of bits and pieces that go with it, but you're starting, as long as you understand, they live on Krakoa, they don't live with human beings anymore, they formed a nation.
And all past sins are forgiven.
That's it.
Yeah.
There's no good guys, there's no bad guys. But the thing is, if you're a new reader, you're not going to think, oh, Apocalypse is a problem. You're not going to think Mystique is a problem. You don't have that baggage. It's only if you're a long-time reader, and long-time readers have a huge problem with that. I mean, if you hang out in any Facebook group or on Twitter or on Reddit, the biggest complaint is, how can you make this person a good guy? How can, we had the Age of Apocalypse. How can he now be? The problem is, if you mired in continuity, you can't, it's actually harder to enjoy the story. And that's why I say jumping around and reading all over the place works for me, because I'm not worrying about a linear progression of everything. Because the minute you want to become a continuity cop, it's cool if you would say, like I said, we were discussing it before we went live. It's cool if it's Savage Dragon, one writer, it's very easy to please.
Yeah.
I bet you nobody can tell me how many people have written X-Men, because I can't tell you.
Everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody wants to tell their story. Exactly. Well, listen, let's not go there, please.
Give it time.
Listen. I don't need a sad X-Men story at this rate. I don't need Wolverine staring out the window in the rain for 34 panels. No, I'm kidding.
I would probably read it.
I feel like that'd be the best Wolverine story.
I probably would too.
Probably. Anyway, so I think the new stories are fairly new. If you start with Docs, I agree with Gabriel 100%. If you leave, Hoxpox is a brilliant piece of setup, and it's a brilliant narrative story with a whole bunch of very clever mechanics, but it doesn't.
Very intellectual.
Very intellectual. It doesn't serve to set. It serves to set the stage for long-time readers. If you picked up X-Men 1 now and you knew they lived on Krakoa, you can enjoy the story from there. And I think that's cool, because there's a mystery about what he's trying to do. That part of the thing about reading an X-Men comic for me is I don't want to know what the next 6 steps are. I don't want to go, oh, yeah, he's going to do this next. Because there's been so many stories like that. And Gold is a very good example of formulaic fan service doing the same thing over and over again. You understand?
So when you said that, it kind of gave me an odd thought. I know we all said Gold is not a good place to start for a new reader, but is it possible that the reason why a lot of all of us who know the continuity kind of was a bit meh about Gold because it was the same thing done again? If you're new to the X-Men and you want a modern story, you don't
Yeah,
know
that could work.
how all of this is old news. It could be something to get that feel of classic X-Men in a modern era.
I like that.
Yeah, I just don't know if they're well constructed enough.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it from that angle.
You know, if I look at them, how they're constructed narratively, etc., they. I want X-Men to be complex. I want, and I want it to be very narratively driven and very strong narratively. I don't want it to be wishy-washy. Don't give me wishy-washy. You can do things I don't like, but make it strong narratively. You understand? And for me, and that's probably why I didn't connect with Blue and Gold, because narratively it was just sort of middle of the road.
By the numbers.
By the numbers. And that's not an indictment on the writers and the creators involved, because all the writers and creators involved with those have done brilliant stuff in other areas, but it's just not for me.
Also, I would say my major complaint about recommending Hickman run, house post, everything to new readers is the background they have with the X-Men. If you are recommending those comics to a reader that comes from seeing the movies or watching the animated series, it may not work because it's not the same. It's not getting the same message, the same style, or anything at all. Like, it's not it's not bad that it's new, but it's not exactly what a lot of people are called to when they ask for X-Men. A lot of people ask for X-Men because they have seen a movie on the cinema, like, oh, I like this concept a lot of people like being marginalized by having powers. It's like what weird and exciting and etc. And they might not be very excited about the concept of house so far. But for people that don't know anything about X-Men, I think yes, it's a good start. But not for people that have that attachment to I like this idea, I want to read comics with this idea, because I haven't read comics with this idea.
Yeah, listen, my daughter's my frame of reference for somebody that's read no X-Men comics, but my daughter's seen every animated X-Men show and every X-Men movie more than I have. Okay?
You're a great father.
I gave her Hox Pox to just have a look at. It is too sophisticated for her, 100%. But then I went and grabbed a 90s comic, and I grabbed an 80s comic, and she gravitates to the 90s and the 80s comics because of that background with the animated series. I mean, she watches the animated series nearly every weekend. I don't think I've even watched it once in completion. Understand?
It's my background also, the same as your daughter. Like, I have the same background. I came to X-Men X-Men comics when I was like 12, and I have watched all the animated series, and I have watched 2 movies in the cinema. So I was like wanting to read comics and see where those stories came from.
The concept of the X-Men being the people who fight for those who fear and hate them. And if you're looking at the modern comics, that is completely gone. You got all these teams. There is not a single one that is fighting explicitly for those who fear and hate them. Nope. It is a very self-serving concept, which we can dive into the symbolism of it and the analogies of it, and we can have it make sense. But if you're going into it expecting that tone, that concept, you will be drastically disappointed, and you're better off going back to the 80s, the 90s, even the 2000s, where they still adhere to that concept.
Yeah, I think he's doing it because it's the exact opposite. Because we've done feared and hated since the 1960s.
Decades.
And I feel like
he's changing it.
And I feel like it still hasn't been done very narratively, making a lot of sense and being a body of work that makes, I don't know, I don't feel like it has done a lot, even if they have tried to do it a lot. I don't feel like it has been done a lot, at least recently. I mean, in the 80s and in the 90s, yes, but I mean, in the 2000s, I don't feel like there's a lot of comics apart from X-Men Red and two more that have done that, like in a way that it's like it's telling me the same story, but it's making me think about it in other ways.
Yeah.
Like how it delivers that analogy has been very hit or miss, and I feel we could talk about for hours on end.
We could do a show about that.
We could do
Oh,
multiple
yeah.
shows.
There's definitely a Docs episode coming in the foreseeable future. So we'll save our thoughts on the Docs era for a little bit further down the road, because that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But so guys, we've run pretty well over an hour now, and I wonder if you all have any final thoughts before we close out on just where's best to jump in with X-Men. I mean, we've covered a wealth of topics, all these great different eras. There's obviously not going to be a definitive answer, but what are you guys' final thoughts?
I would say, just if you're going to take anything away from us rambling the past hour about X-Men, just jump in. It's like a pool, stick your toe in the water, see if it feels good, read what you want to read. And I will say this, as a huge Star Wars nut and an X-Men fan, probably they're the most two brutalist fan bases in all of nerddom. Okay, none more violent than X-Men and Star Wars nerds. Okay, because God forbid if you sit here and you like a certain era and because it's new or something like that, oh, you can't read it. Oh, you can't. Oh my God, whatever. Put your toe in the pool, see what you like, and if you like a certain era, regardless if it's not popular, just read it, have fun. Comics are fun, and that's why we read them, and that's why we're all here. So, yeah, so that's my.
I'm going to piggyback off of that because I'm going to say something that might get me a lot of ire from the X-Men fandom, and that is Wikipedia is your friend. There is a lot of heavy continuity. If you pick up a story and you're a little bit lost, you can hop on the internet, you can Google it, you can get caught up, and you can get to the point where you can then continue on and enjoy the story.
Correct.
There is no shame in having not read 6 decades worth of comics. Like, who has the time to do all of that when you're just getting into it? So use the internet. It's okay. There's no shame. Just Google it. You want to figure out why the heck there are 2 different Psylocks, you want to just Google it. There's an answer. It's there. It's easy. Don't worry.
Yeah, and you can also Google why Wolverine is the best X person. So,
well, that would be a lie. That's not a lie if we're talking about Laura. I can get behind that one. Laura, yeah. Logan, no.
Sorry, Toon Boon. I had it ready for that moment.
Prepared.
Tuna is prepared.
Yeah, piggyback off Gabriel. If use the internet. If you go and click on Google right now and Google the 10 best X-Men stories or the 25 best X-Men stories, there's a really superb article by Jay Darden from Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men that he wrote for Polygon. I'm telling you now, Google that list. Fantastic place to start. Okay. I wanted to, everybody's flashing comics. I wanted to flash a few things. Do you guys remember this? The official Marvel Index.
Yes.
To the X-Men. This is how you used to keep track of what you'd read and what you hadn't read. Way back
and you
when.
learned about packages.
Because before internet, you actually got a comic that told you what you'd missed.
Yes.
Anyway, so use the internet, guys. There's 100 experts out there that can give you 100 recommendations.
Yeah, I guess since everybody's flashing, my final thoughts are just read what you enjoy. I just started Messiah Complex, and they talk a lot about House of M in it. And last night I'm thinking, you know what? So I ordered House of M, and now I can catch up on that. That's that's the fun of comics. Like Mike said, it's fun. Just dive in, find a place that looks cool. And if you don't know what's going on when you jump into Messiah Complex and you're wondering what Scarlet Witch did to everybody, Google it. It works. I'm not lost. It's awesome.
The short version is she did them real nasty. That's all you need to know. She did them real nasty, and then you're good to go.
Yeah, it's true. There's not
Everybody
that
hates
much
her.
setup. And it's honestly our recommendations in action. This is what I think a lot of us do. And this is where the discussion comes from. We jump into what we like, and that's where we start talking about.
Duna, any final thoughts?
So I think what everyone said about like if you find a character and you are like, who's this person? I should Google where they appear and find out everything about them because you love them a lot. That's like a good way to get into X-Men, because it's difficult to get into the like whole story, like know everything about everyone. I don't know everything about everyone. I've been reading for a lot of years, and I read mostly X-Men for a lot of like periods. So for example, I choose like I don't know, like 7 or like the New Mutants. I fall in love with all the characters, so I choose them all, and I have been reading everything by each one of them, and I still haven't completed each one of them, but I'm on my way to read everything by each one. So you can choose 1, you can choose 7, you can choose wherever you like and go back and read more by them. I think that's a good way to get to know. I think that's a good way to get to know X-Men.
There's
Like
there's a website somewhere, I don't know what it is, I have no idea how to find it, but it exists, where it takes each character and it just gives you all of their appearances.
Yep.
So you could chronologically follow like Sunspot, who's awesome, and you can just follow every issue that he's appeared in, so you can follow Sunspot's story and not worry about anybody else.
Yeah, I
Ooh,
think
that's
it's the
excellent.
complete. I think it's the complete Marvel reading order, and you can put and you can put in Fantastic Four, X-Men, Sunspot, etc., etc. You can just Google that.
And also don't worry about doing the same with characters you've seen in films and you are interested about. Like if you see X-Men and you see Mystic is a badass, I want to know more about her. You just have to like go and know more about her. I don't know, I think that's a good way to read X-Men. I think
a shock. That's a shock to your system. You use Mystique in the movies, and then you go read about Mystique in the comics. and then you go read the Draco, and then like.
For some reason, I totally forgot that they remade Mystique in the new movies, and I was thinking about the old movies. But anyway, but yes, I think that's a good way. I think it's a better way than trying to obsess over knowing everything about X-Men. I think that's a difficult, if impossible thing to do about such a wide canon, or like get into.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
I've made the effort to read one. I've read 1 through 300 chronologically, but it's a slog.
I tried.
You know what I'm saying? And I mean, I wouldn't say I didn't do. I mean, I've gone back and I got to 300. I gave up. I had enough. I was done. I was like, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'd rather go look for stuff I haven't read. So I haven't read Academy X. I haven't read New X-Men. Yeah, I have read New X-Men. Academy X. Yeah, New X-Men, Volume 1 and 2. All the kids, all the younger generation. I haven't read that yet, so I've got all of that to look forward to.
So I think everybody's made awesome points. I don't think I can expound upon anything that anybody's said. I will simply add, go to your local comic shop, go to the quarter bins, and fish out a copy of X-Men #1 from 1991. They will have numerous copies of them. They might even let you have it for free. That's what it's
not in my country.
Got that beautiful Jim Lee art. It's a pretty good primer for all things X-Men, just whatever. And you know what? That's the book that got me hooked. So if you don't own a copy of X-Men #1, there you go. You can get one for 25 cents. But I think that's it for us for this episode. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Daniel Hutchins for all of his participation in the comments. We are the Comic Watchers, and this has been episode 82 of the Comic Watchers Show. Thank you all. Support your local comic shop and read more comics.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Right.